Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Q&A about business innovation and managing life. I was away last week, so this is, I think, and we've had a sort of special one of these talking about ChatGPT. So we are back talking about business innovation and managing life here, and I see we have a number of questions saved up. There's a question from Katie. What is your favorite blog or book that you've written? Any specific reason why or why not? You know, I have to say, in terms of books, I've written about 10 books altogether. Many of them are collections of things I've written elsewhere. But for me, there's the clear favorite book is my book, A New Kind of Science, because it took me 10 years to write, which is vastly longer than anything else. It's the biggest commitment I've made to a single piece of writing ever. I spent most of the 1990s working on that project. It's a big book. I'm very happy with it. I refer to it usually in its online form. Sometimes many times a day. Other times there'll be a gap because I'm not working on things related to it. But it is a great source, both its main text and the notes in the back. The notes in the back are really, I think, quite good, succinct summaries of lots and lots of issues, and I use them a lot. It also has code in it that I also use. So yes, that would have to be my favorite. But at any given time, I have to say I'm always working on a particular new project, and usually the thing I'm now working on is at least my temporary favorite. And I think that's necessary because I tend to work on things that are really rather different in terms of the things that I write. I'm always kind of like I'm making a change of direction, and then I really have to be dived into that change of direction. It takes me a little while to do that sometimes. Like, for example, I just wrote, came out, a week and a bit ago, this piece about how does ChatGPT work and why does it work? And I'm about to dive into something about kind of thinking about the future and AI and its relationship to sort of human activities in the future and so on. And so I'm really kind of diving deep into that, which is what I need to do in order to be able to really write the things I want to write. And so that will be at least my temporary favorite as I work on it. And I find it difficult. These things require sort of a lot of focus and really understanding sort of all the pieces of what's involved, then trying to write those down. And then I go on to the next thing and try and understand all aspects of that. And while I'm working on something, that's always my favorite thing. But in terms of my sort of lifetime sequence, I would say that New Kind of Science has to be the favorite because it took a decade of my life. And, I put a lot into it, and it's been a super useful reference for me, and I think lots of other people in the time since then. I think it's only pity is that there are many pieces of it that should be kind of have found their way into the Wikipedias of this world and so on. I don't think as much of it has been put in there as should have been, which is disappointing, and I encourage people to do it. People are very welcome to do it. Judy is asking, how was my trip? Was it for business or for fun? Okay, what was my trip? I went to Morocco, and I went there because I had been invited to a conference about a field that I was deeply involved in, the kind of initiation of field of studying complexity and its implications and so on. I was deeply involved in sort of the initiation of that field, or at least a version of that field in the 1980s, early 1980s. And this was a conference about that field, bringing together many of the people who'd worked on that field actually before it really existed in the 80s. And they're now quite old. And this was sort of an opportunity to see some of these people who, in many cases, I hadn't seen in 40 years. Plus, I've never been to Morocco or even, in fact, continental Africa before. And I thought that would be interesting, and it was interesting. And no, I don't really do. I did spend, how long did I spend? I spent maybe 2 hours out of the 5-day trip or something doing the average tourist things and so on. But I'm not really a very good tourist traveler. I'm mostly a meet the locals and visit different kinds of educational establishments, business things, sometimes government things, and so on, in different places. This was interesting, and I as I say, the thing that I thought was kind of amusing was that of the sort of keynote speakers at this conference about complexity, I think I might have actually been the youngest. And since I'm pretty ancient by now, I was thinking this is kind of this is the last time in my life probably when I'll be the youngest speaker at a conference. The oldest was 102. He was very, very well preserved, an interesting chap, named Edgar Morin. I even did a little bit of an interview with him, although it was a challenge because at least at the beginning, it seemed like he only spoke French. And my knowledge of French is actually turns out not as bad as I thought it was, but it's rather theoretical and challenging for me to actually speak it. But eventually, after a small period of thinking that the only form of communication was from English to Arabic to French, we did manage to discover that we could actually converse in English, so that was good. And in fact, that we did a bit of a video, which hopefully will show up at some point on the web. Some interesting questions and answers, I think. Not sure I got my total tip about how to live to the age of 100 or beyond. I think the main feeling, which is certainly one that I anecdotally tend to see, is you have to be lucky, health-wise and so on, but you also have to stay interested in stuff, and that's a very it's a good longevity tip, I think. Do things that actually feel like you're interested in what comes in the future, so to speak. So that's the answer to my trip. Let's see. I have to say it's a complicated decision for me whether to do trips or not. I think this one was interesting, but before the pandemic happened, I'd been doing a fair number of trips, for sometimes going to things like business events and business conferences and things like that. And I was a little disappointed. Looking back, I'm a person who tends to try and write trip reports where I try and sort of write down what happened. And sometimes that involves defining various follow-ups of, yes, I talked to this person, oh, I got to go and look up this thing or get back to that person about this thing. But also it allows me to kind of have a memory of what really happened on these trips. And then years later, I can go back and see, well, wait a minute, what did I get out of this trip? Was this trip really worthwhile? And I was a bit disappointed looking back at business trips business conferences and things I've been to, that I would say that the sort of the obvious, several years later, it's kind of like, well, what really happened? Answer, not very much. And sort of not a great way to spend my time, at least, in some of these cases. Let's see. As a question just came in from Cal asking, as a remote CEO, do you ever get cabin fever? Being home constantly, do you try to work in different rooms to combat this? I don't, actually. I always thought that would be a good thing to do, but it never has been. I have to say that the sort of the diversity of things that I end up working on are sufficiently great that the fact that I'm sitting in one place and I have all my computers set up and the nice office chair and all that kind of thing, I mean, that wins out over, I need a change of place. I have a change of activity without having a change of place. Now, that said, I do like to, for the first couple of meetings usually of each day, I tend to be walking. And when it's above 40 degrees Fahrenheit outside, which it isn't right now, sadly, I tend to walk outside, and that, of course, provides something of a change of scenery. Otherwise, it's walking inside on a treadmill, which is less exciting. But for me, I don't tend to have that effect, and I think that for me, my efficiency in working is just much higher when I'm sort of sitting at my desk than it is, oh, I'm off in a hotel somewhere or something, using my laptop, or even if I bring sort of fancier stuff, it's kind of like, oh, it's kind of gets uncomfortable sitting in the the chair for too long, or it's there's some other reason why it's kind of not as easy to concentrate on what I'm actually interested in as it is in my sort of natural habitat. So I tend to just do that. Aaron asks here, have you ever tried tracking your sentiment as you work by using a neural net to analyze the video feed of your face or body? Many, many years ago, it's like 25 years ago, maybe, I did record some video of me working, and I was like horrified by all the kinds of strange, picking at different things that I did when I was doing that. And I also sometimes have the terrible habit, I suppose, of sort of whistling while I work, probably quite tunelessly. I've never really tried to record it and embarrassed myself by doing that. But yes, it would be an interesting thing to know what one's kind of because when I'm working, I'm usually really paying attention to what I'm doing, so I have no idea what what expressions get made. It will be kind of interesting to correlate those things, I suppose. I sort of haven't. I haven't gotten I did that just once, and it was kind of like a bit horrifying, and I haven't done it again. Let's see. So Guil says that struggling with nagging feeling that they're progressing slower than they want to. I know I'm doing what I can, but still can't shake that off. Have you ever dealt with this? If so, how? Well, let's see. I mean, any project I do, I tend to do difficult projects. So there are often times when it's like things are going slowly, things are not working, things are not fitting together. And I suppose for me, and perhaps not such a useful thing to say, I sort of know in the back of my mind, I've done hundreds of projects before, and they typically work out. And so the fact that there's this sort of low point of, oh my gosh, maybe I've got to, it does occur to me sometimes, maybe I finally hit the one project that I won't be able to do. But I don't take that sort of feeling that seriously, because I'm like confident, look, I've done all these other projects before, and I don't really think there's no reason for this one to be fundamentally more difficult than others, although there may be some particular thing that I've run into that makes it more difficult. I mean, any one of these, to me, it's a sign that I'm doing projects I should be doing when they seem difficult. When they seem like super easy, I have to say that's usually the time when I don't do a good job. And that's usually the time when it isn't really that interesting a project. I mean, it's sort of analogous to, I think I mentioned this, in some of these Q&A sessions that I do, particularly the one about science and technology for kids and others, whenever I get a question where I say, wait a minute, that's an easy question, I can answer that with no trouble at all. Those are the ones that go the worst. Somehow, I think it is a feature of kind of when you get to a project that doesn't quite engage you emotionally, because it isn't quite the thing that is really a stretch to do, those are the ones, at least for me, that don't work very well. I mean, I had that experience in the, when was it? In the mid 1980s, no, early-ish, 83, 84 type time frame. I had built my first big computer system, SMP, which was a symbolic manipulation program, kind of a forerunner of Wolfram language. It was difficult, it was really difficult. Then I thought, look, I just want to do a software engineering project. And so I decided I'm going to make a C interpreter of the C programming language. And, it was sort of ahead of its time and all that kind of thing. But I thought, look, I know how to do this. This is an easy project. It was I don't think I did a good job. I had some other people working on it. I made a bunch of probably management mistakes and ways of dividing the project up. And really, I saw that project as just too easy and didn't do a very good job, I think, on it. I saw the same thing a number of years later with Steve Jobs, actually, who had done, he'd done Apple, the first iteration, the Mac, all that kind of thing. Then he had his new company Next, where he's like, I'm building a computer. I know how to build computers. I'm building another computer. I have this one. I can do it. And I think it didn't go so well. I think then when he came back to Apple and it sort of was difficult and he was solving oh my gosh, this is really a difficult problem, things went really well again. And I feel like, I think it's a common thing for people that you do your best when the thing you're trying to do is really something of a stretch, and you don't do so well when it's like feels easy. So I think that the feeling that things are difficult is not a bad feeling. It's a feeling which you have to think of as a way to sort of make, it's a proof that what you're doing is really worthwhile. You're doing something that's at the outer limit of what you can do. You're not sort of wasting your time in some sense, doing something that's easy for you to do. So that's at least my sort of psychology of thinking about projects when they get hard. I think one thing, in my opinion, not to do is to say, oh my God, this is hard. Let me put it, let me postpone it. That's usually a very bad idea, at least for me. It tends to be the case. It's gotten hard. Okay, well, maybe, today I'm feeling kind of tired, so let me wait until tomorrow, but not, oh, let's just put this, this thing will magically get better when, over time, because it won't. Most of the time, the project is going to be the same project that it ever was. And, the sooner, one statement I tend to make sometimes to teams is, the project won't get finished until after it's been started. So you might as well get it started so that you have a chance of getting it finished by a certain time. Now, this statement about things don't get easier if you just leave them for a while, that's not always true. Some business and management kinds of things do get easier if you leave them a while. There are what I sometimes refer to as self-answering questions, where you just leave it and, necessarily by the passage of time, something is going to resolve. It's like the oft quoted kind of medical prognosis kind of thing. Whatever you have, it's either going to get better or it's going to get worse. If it gets better, well, maybe you don't even know what it was and you don't worry about it. If it gets worse, it becomes more sort of localized what the problem is, and you can figure out what to do about it. But so, there are situations there where it's kind of like it will just resolve by the passage of time. Some business question will just be, yes, if you let it stay in your kind of pending email for a month, then chances are it will have resolved itself and you won't have to spend all that time to figure out what was going on. I think that is less true of a short timescales in my experience with intellectual kinds of things, where it's sort of all on me to solve it. It's all on me to solve it. So I'm either going to get it solved or not. Now, occasionally there'll be things where, well, I'm going to learn something about this. I'm going to be, in some situation where I learn some background to this thing that will make it easier to solve. There's some sort of exogenous effect where it becomes easier to solve. The other thing that happens is over long periods of time, like decades, there are questions or problems, things you might do, where it's like, it was really hard back then, but it suddenly got easy. I mean, there are things with, the modern large language model story in AI, where it was like, it was really hard before, but now there's a new technology and it suddenly became easy. And there are things where it's like, oh, I'm glad I didn't spend time on that back whenever, because it just got a lot easier through no fault of my own, so to speak, just because of ambient technology in the world. And so sometimes, I think when I think about what projects to do, I often think about, is this the right time to do this project? Or is it the case that if I wait for a number of years, potentially, that somehow this project will become easier to do? But it's not on a time scale of order weeks. where it's like just procrastinating, so to speak. That doesn't tend to be the case with intellectual projects, unless, as I say, there's some exogenous thing. Oh, I'm going to go to this event and I'm going to learn about this and talk to a bunch of people who work on this, and I'll get a better way to kind of orient my thinking, and then I should start working on it after that. Let's see. Yeah, but by the way, I mean, this question about sort of progressing slower than one wants to, I mean, it's kind of like, well, how fast should it go? Particularly if you're doing something that's never been done before. The thing that tends to happen to me is that projects end up having some sort of inexorable rate. And if I try and rush them, let's say something I'm writing, I try and rush it, it ends up wasting time in the end, because I rush it, and yeah, I can get through that section or whatever it is more quickly, but then I look back at it and it's like, yeah, that really wasn't very good. And then you have this painful moment of, was it good enough, or do I have to rewrite it, let's say? And in the end, it wastes a lot of time, I think, and it's better just to go at the inexorable pace you're going at and do it as well as you can do it first time around, rather than come back and do it again. Now, having said that, there are sometimes cases where you do a project and you realize after the fact, oh gosh, I could have done that much better. And your best situation is start the whole thing again and redo it. Now, typically, I think it's a common statement made in sort of various technology things, that sort of plan to throw one away. And then the kind of the sub part to that is, but you never will. In other words, you never end up sort of doing a project a second time. In my life, I actually have done projects second times, but usually spaced out by more than a decade. And for example, I built SMP, this first sort of computational language initiative that was done 1979 to 1981, 1982 type time frame. And for all kinds of complicated reasons, I ended up sort of restarting that in a quite separate, fresh start in 1986. And yes, it is really true that the fact that I'd sort of done one before, made a bunch of mistakes, was doing it again, didn't make those mistakes. But for all kinds of reasons, it was a very fresh project for me. It wasn't something where it was like, oh, I'm just doing the same thing again. It felt very fresh, even though I'd had the experience of doing a similar project before. Same thing a little bit with our physics project. I'd kind of done a precursor to that in the late 1990s, and then came back to sort of do it again in late 2019. And that, again, there were different circumstances, different people involved, some slightly different ideas. It felt very fresh, but the fact that I'd sort of done something similar before was very useful in being able to frame what to do. Let's see. Okay, 0DD is asking, what management strategies do you use to get the most out of your employees? I suppose there are a few things to say. I mean, one is, to my mind, the sort of most important thing to begin with is defining vision, defining direction, providing that kind of sort of vision leadership, and being able to kind of, show that direction. That's one thing. Another thing is, it's always challenging. You've got projects you want to do, you've got people, maybe you've got people you've found over the course of many years that are, fit very well into the culture of your organization and so on. But, do they fit with the projects you want to do? Can you fit these puzzle pieces together? That to me is a big challenge. And when you do it well, you get very good results. When you're kind of feeding people projects they really can't do or don't want to do, it's not going to go so well. I think the other thing is that when you define a project and you say, okay, do this project, you kind of have to have a sense of how broken down that project has to be for any given person to be able to be successful with it. I see plenty of cases where there's this project, and it's a bit fuzzy, and it's just not digestible by the group of people it's been given to. It's, maybe some other group would do it, but, some would be able to do it in that undigested form. Usually when it's like that, they'll take it off in a direction where you look at it and you say, well, that's not really what I would have done, although you might be happy with it. But the question is, have you got it into a form where it's kind of where it can be taken from that definition by the people you've actually given it to execute it? So I found that that's being able to find the right people, connect them to the right project, define a good vision for the project, and make sure that it's kind of defined to the point where the people you've given it to can actually make progress with it. I think then, as far as I'm concerned, part of what I feel is my responsibility is to give people interesting things to do, and to make it be the case that one is sort of pulling people, stretching people so that they're doing things that are appropriately challenging for them. Maybe a different level of challenge for different people at different times, all those kinds of things. But giving people interesting things to do, and of course there may be some particular thing what needs done, which will be super interesting to one person and quite uninteresting to another. Maybe the person to whom it will be super interesting, it's a bigger stretch to do that project than it is for the person who it isn't so interesting to. That's again a complicated balancing act of, do you give the project to the person for whom it's a stretch, even knowing that it might be too big a stretch and the project might not get done properly. I think I perhaps err on the side of giving it to the people for whom it would be a stretch more than the other way around. Then I think a general point is that, at least in my style of doing things, sort of different people you handle differently. I mean, there are people where it's very cut and dried. There are people where there's quite a lot of latitude in what happens. There are people where just a different style of interaction. And insofar as one can have a reasonable repertoire of different styles of interaction that fit with different people, that allows one to have a sort of broader range of people working with one on projects and so on. I think if one has a very fixed style, then that sort of constrains a set of people, because only people who can work with that particular style. Certainly, my own repertoire isn't far from infinite, so to speak. And there are people for whom it's a good fit, and there are people where it just doesn't fit at all, and they're not going to be people I can work with. And I think sometimes when it's a question of picking the right people, and gradually over time, I've certainly in our organization has learnt the kinds of people who have the right kind of thinking approach to things and sort of independence of mind and so on to be a good fit in our particular kind of corporate culture. Okay, E-Ray is asking, how can I increase the chance of my admission to a master's degree in complex systems or cognitive science? Look, I think one thing to say about things like that is there are situations in which you just sort of file an application and hope for the best. And there are situations where you're effectively making a deal. There are situations where there's a giant organization and it's like they're going to be 50,000 people applying for admission to this college, and you just file your documents, hope for the best, check the boxes, etc. And there are cases where you're getting a job with a startup or something, and the startup has 5 employees. You're not, or you shouldn't be, or not realistically, are you just filing your paperwork and hoping for the best? That's going to be a sort of a personal interaction with the CEO or whatever else it is. And it's going to be much more of a, is there a deal to be made where you go work for that startup than it is just file the paperwork, so to speak. And I would say at different stages in sort of the education process in different countries, it's different. It kind of eventually becomes, in many cases, much more of a, there's an advisor there's a person, and you interact with that person, you develop a relationship with that person, and they're interested in what you're doing, you're interested in what they're doing, and it's like, oh yeah, you should come here and you can work on my grant, paid for by my grant or whatever. And that's sort of the way it happens. rather than just you blind send in, oh, there's, I'm going to apply to 300 places. Well, that won't be 300, but 20 places or something, and and hope for the best, so to speak. And I think it tends to be the case at the college level. It's much more file the paperwork and hope for the best. At the PhD level, for smaller subjects, probably excluding things like physics and math, but for smaller subjects with smaller departments, it is, I think, much more of a personal interaction type story. I think master's degrees is probably an intermediate case, and it depends on the size of group, size of university, the university, all those kinds of things. But in terms of how do you sort of present yourself so that somebody believes you'll be sort of able to do the program, be useful potentially in some research program? Well, I think, having done research yourself and being able to say, look, I did this thing. And, if you get the person to read it, if they don't read it, well, that doesn't really work. But that kind of, it's a two-way street. I mean, it's kind of like, I think to some extent, some of these kind of recruiting, I'll call them, mechanisms in academia and so on, have a certain degree of efficiency. That is, if you apply to place X and place X rejects you, maybe that's a good thing, because actually you wouldn't have fitted in place X, even though you didn't know it. And even though you didn't do enough research to find out you wouldn't have fitted in place X, or you wouldn't have liked place X, they kind of do it for you. I think one of the things that I tend to think about, like things like college admissions, is that nobody really completely knows what they're trying to achieve there, in the following sense. If you're an HR person at a company, then, if you're doing your job well, what you are trying to do is to hire employees who are going to help the productivity of the company. And that's the overarching objective, is, increase the productivity of the company by hiring the right people or the best people, whatever. I think that at a university, it's not so clear. There might have been a time when the goal was, let's bring in students who are going to, have the professors have fun teaching them. But I think at this point, the sort of admissions process, at least at American universities, not so true in all places around the world, is sufficiently detached from the actual teaching part that that's no longer really a factor. And then, if you get cynical about it, it's like, oh, well, bring in people who'll, be good donors, or they're in the future, or their families will be good donors now, or whatever else. That's kind of another piece. Or another piece might be some kind of, theory of, there's another piece, which is the school has a certain number of, computer science professors, a certain number of, swimming pools, a certain number of French literature, professors. You want to bring in a sort of a freshman class that will not want, 5 times as many French literature professors as you actually have, so to speak. That is a resource match with what the university actually has on offer. So that's another thing. And, you might want to bring in you might have other constraints. You might want to bring in just sort of a class that you think will lead to sort of vibrancy of the university community, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or you might have particular kind of socially oriented goals about the class that you're bringing in, or whatever else. But I think the sort of the net thing that tends to happen is that it's like, let's bring in a class that's like other classes we've had before. Let's bring in students who are like the ones we had before, because the university has sort of evolved to deal with students who are particular, with particular characteristics or particular sort of culture, particular kind of pattern, so to speak. And insofar as it's evolved for that, well, if we bring in more that are the same, it's going to work next time around. So there tends to be sort of is the person a fit? Well, the person might be great in some sense. They might be spectacular academically. They might be, fantastic, social, whatever's. They might do this and that and the other, but they might not be like they might be sort of different from what has been there before, and it's not clear. You want the academically best. You might want the ones who are kind of like what's been there before. So I tend to think that's the that's sort of the effective evolved feature there, and the same is sort of, I would say, perhaps decreasingly true as you go to sort of higher levels in the academic sequence, so to speak. I mean, it's worth realizing that at the PhD level, particularly, lots of students at that level are supported by outside research grants. And a large part of that picture is, okay, I get the student, they're interested in this, they can be attached to this grant, they can be put to work on this project, and so on. And an important thing to ask at that level is, well, do you actually like the projects that are on offer there? If you really don't like them, there's likely to be a problem. Now, in rare cases, you'll be in a situation where I should say most students at the PhD level do not come in with their own projects. They mostly come in and sort of get attached to some project that some professor is already doing. It's a very rare case where a student will come in and say, I really want to work on this, and have their own project and their own project definition and just want advice on that project. I think it's great when that happens. It's sometimes very, in practice, inconvenient or even unmanageable in an actual sort of practical setting, because it's like, well, this student wants to work on this, but unfortunately, we have no grant, no funding that can be applied to that particular thing. Even though it might be fun to talk to the student about it, the student is going to have to, there's no way to support that student. So those are issues that come up. Let's see, there's a question here about, from Sadi. How do you decide when to make a big change in technology that you use, for example, using the example of switching from Wolfram Workbench on Eclipse to VS Code? It's a complicated thing. You bet on a certain technology, you build a bunch of things on that technology, and sometimes you say, drat, that technology didn't make it, even though it should have made it. In neural nets, for example, we have sort of the base technology we're switching it for the 4th time. And each time we bet on something, we're not, I think, stupid in what we bet on. And I would say that one thing to say about technologies and what you bet on is, you got to look at what's been happening with that technology. Is it being sort of worked on by an energetic organization that has a future? Is it something where it all sort of went to seed and nobody cares about it? Is it something where it's liable to be, oh yes, it's working, there's a fine little company that's doing it now, but that company's probably going to get eaten by a bigger fish, and the bigger fish is going to be very difficult to deal with, those kinds of things. It's a complicated assessment for a technology. Does it have, what is its trajectory? I don't think it's the case that you always, and certainly we don't always pick, oh, that's the most popular thing, everybody's doing that, let's do that, let's do that too. That's actually not a great strategy often. The thing to do, in my experience, is you try to understand what's the trajectory, how good is it? Is it well put together? Is it going to be a solid foundation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think that this question of you bet on one horse and then you realize you have to change horses, that can happen. It's very frustrating, actually, when it happens, because usually a lot of work to change horses, to change technologies and so on. And you have to hope that, we figure for some kinds of things, if we've got a 5-year run with a particular technology, particular investment in it, that's sort of good enough. And that's an okay bet. And yes, it's going to cost a bunch of money to retool things when we sort of change bets, but at least we had that 5-year run. I think there's another question of when, adopting technology is too early. That's another thing that can happen. Say it's a fantastic technology, but it's not really ready yet. And I can tell you, when we first started working on Wolfram language back in 1986, there's a question of, we were using C programming language, but C++ wasn't really ready yet. C++ was always compiled back into C. The code was very inefficient. It didn't really work very well. So we built our own kind of object-oriented extension of C. And that was, that was an expensive thing to do at the time. And it worked out fine for us, but it was the right thing not to bet on C++ because it was too early. Later on, 10 years later, it would have been the right thing to bet on C++ and just use that as the main implementation language. But at the time, it was a little bit too early. I mean, there are other technologies where it's too early and you don't bet on them, and you say, you say, phew, I didn't bet on this because, in fact, it didn't make it. And there are other cases where you say, so different things can happen. Within our company, one of the things that is a challenge is I try to get kind of, when we make a bet on a technology, I try to have a sort of serious group of people from around the company try and assess that technology before we make that bet. Because I found that, you need to look at it from a kind of a business and organizational point of view of what's the organization like, somebody to do some due diligence on that. You need to look at it from a technology point of view. You need to look at it from the how does it fit into our technology stack point of view. There's a bunch of different things. And it's a place where experience really counts. And so having people from different parts of the company, even if they don't know about this specific use case, this specific project, having them kind of look at some technology we might be betting on is really quite a useful thing. And sometimes, though, it's very challenging to make that happen, because what tends to happen is some developer somewhere, some engineer somewhere will say, oh, I'm just going to prototype this. I'm going to try it out. Let me see whether this technology is worth looking at. And they build that prototype. And then it's like, well, this is working pretty well. Let's just keep going with this. And it's very hard to get that actual moment when it's like, we're going to make a technology decision. Because also, it's not worth convening the big group of people to do the deep dive if the person could have tried to do a prototype and the prototype was just a complete failure. There's no point in even discussing it at that point. So it's a little tricky to figure out where's the moment where you say, we're betting on a technology, let's go do an assessment of this and see whether this makes sense. But that's something that is something that I've been trying to do. I get kind of upset when I discover we've just started using some technology and we never really talked about it, and it's just sort of crept into our technology stack. Because when you introduce, for example, let's say code written in some different language, it's a certain commitment to do that, because you're going to have to maintain that, going to have somebody who knows about it, and so on. So I think that's a that's a piece that we think about. Let's see. So let's see here. Okay, there's a question from Eigen here. Saying good project definitions, formalizing what a project means is one very important part, but how much does money, stock options, vacations to avoid burnout and so on influence employee morale, or giving them a project that they want to work on, or people they want to work with? Maybe it's just me, but I think having something one really wants to work on and feeling like one's doing something that is significant to one and to whatever one cares about, so to speak, I think that is the most important thing. I think the mechanics of kind of, if your main motivation is, I'm doing this to make money, for example, it's, well, okay, I should say, because I've mostly worked for the last 36 years on a company that isn't on a track to kind of have a giant sort of liquidity event where everybody sort of makes lots of money from it. It's really on a track to try and build something useful and hopefully gradually make money, so to speak. It's not the same kind of motivation by adventure of I'm going to join a startup and, oh, the startup's going to be really big and I'm going to make, gazillions of dollars from it. I think it's a very different motivation structure because, the vast majority of startups fail. And I've certainly talked to, remember, for some reason, it's sticking out of my mind, one person, a longtime employee of ours, who ended up deciding he was going to go off to Silicon Valley and, and sort of pay him a fortune there and so on. And there's a number of years later, I talked to him. He says, yeah, I've worked for a bunch of startups. Actually, it's 7 startups, and every single one of them has failed. It's a very different proposition. It's kind of like it's an adventure way to lead life, as opposed to, look, I'm working on something that I care about, and that's what's important to me. It's well, maybe I'll hit the jackpot, maybe I won't. It's a different kind of thing. Different sort of psychology and personality and so on. I think the particular things I've done have not really been of that character. Actually, we're in the process of doing a spin-off company right now that might be a little bit more of that. Well, will probably be more of that character. But that's an unusual thing, and it takes a bit of a readjustment. I always like to do things that are a bit different. This is something different, and where it will be more of a kind of an adventure story, so to speak. I think that this question of when somebody says, if you give me more money, I'm going to care more about what I'm doing, I don't know. I've not seen that work. That tends to be it's kind of like people saying, give me a better title and I'll do my work better. It's like, really? I mean, it's somehow that it's kind of a proxy for the satisfaction people get from actually doing something they're interested in doing. The proxy is sort of give me more candy, so to speak. And I just don't think, I think it's just a way of delaying sort of an inevitable kind of, I don't really like what I'm doing type thing. Now, that said, it's, there are situations in which people feel they kind of, it sort of eats at them to have something where, oh, I'm just called a junior such and such. And, it kind of bugs them that that's the case. And then, it could be the case that if that's kind of fixed, then they're not bugged by that and it helps. I'm not sure how significant that effect is. But I think this question of, okay, so then there's the question of sort of the burnout and so on. I'll tell you something that I've noticed, which is I've done lots of big projects in my life with lots of people, with lots of intensity. And, when you have these projects that are very intense and people have to work very hard and it's, lots of long hours and so on, you're pushing towards this project, you might think, oh my gosh, people are going to say, I just don't want to do this, I'm quitting. Doesn't happen. The time when people quit is after the project got done. There's this kind of anticlimactic moment when, we worked very hard, we did something we really found interesting and fulfilling, we achieved something, and then, oh, there's this big vacuum afterwards. That's the time you really have to worry about people, people quitting, because it's like, okay, what's next? I did this big thing, it was exciting, it was fulfilling, and then it's like, oh, I'm just looking at, years of, I don't know what I'm doing now. And so, for many people, it's really quite important to find, what's the next intense project that people can at least think about, even if it hasn't reached its moment of intensity yet, a sort of a direction to look forward to, so to speak. And so I've, my tendency tends to be, in a situation where there's a high amount of intensity. Yes, there are people who have all kinds of things going on in their lives, and they booked a vacation at the time that coincides with some grand, product release, and so on and so on and so on. And people say, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry I booked this vacation. But look, you don't know when the product is going to ship or whatever, and you booked your vacation or whatever. And, unless it's really, really, really like super impossible, my tendency is just work around those things. Just, people take their vacations when they wanted to take them and when they booked to take them, and you figure out how to deal with that. And you kind of, and people are, you try and get enough information from people that if they just say, oh no, I just don't work after 5 p.m. or something, and it's like, really, why not? And they say, well, because I've got to go collect my kid from somewhere. Okay, fine. But then, then you understand what's going on, rather than it's just kind of the, oh, as a matter of principle, I'm not doing this, which usually is not such a good thing. But if you do understand what their actual constraints are and so on, being able to, in a civilized way, work around those is, I think, valuable. It takes more management effort, but I think that's the valuable thing to do. And certainly we've had over the course of time, many people who work in their particular hours and days and times when they can't work, and they're in a different time zone, and they're this and that and the other. And it's kind of like, so you adapt to that. And if you figure out how you get the most productivity, rather than trying to make the sort of cookie cutter where we're defining it has to work this way. It's like, well, you've got this particular asset of this employee, let's say, and how can you sort of adapt that to what you need to do? In terms of, I think sort of my own tendency is to feel that the number one driver of employee morale is having interesting things to work on, I think. But maybe that's a statement only about the particular company I've built and the particular sort of culture and type of people that it has. But that's certainly been my observation. And I think that other kinds of things like, put an extra foosball table there or something, not that anybody shows up to offices anymore, but, is a very secondary effect in my experience. It's interesting. Eigen comments, they've been one to say, if I get more money, I'll care more. And in the end, it didn't work. Yeah, I'm not surprised. I completely, from what I've seen, I know for myself, for example, many life choices I've made are do the more interesting thing rather than the thing that makes more money, for example. I think it's one of these things where there's a, there are certain kinds of things in life which cost certain amounts of money, and it may really matter to you that you can achieve those particular things. But I would say that sort of it can be the case that the main thing you're interested in is making money for the sake of making money, just because it's kind of fun and it's kind of a game to make more money. But I think that's that can be a motivation in its own right. But if you're motivated by as many people are, by sort of the content and the daily work that people are doing, then it's that is a secondary issue typically. It doesn't, in terms of quality of life and satisfaction, it doesn't seem to be. It's like, well, it's kind of cool that one has, it's a question of I would say the limiting case of that is, let me do something I absolutely don't want to do for 40 years so I can retire and do what I actually want to do. And I have essentially never seen that work well. Well, is that true? I've seen a few cases where people, quotes, retire much younger because they sell a company or something like this, and then do something that is kind of a second act that's really works well. But I would say that's a rare case. The case of, let me do something I really don't want to do just to make money so that later on I can do the thing I want to do, is just, I think that's really a bad setup. Not least because people often, when they actually get into doing the thing they always wanted to do, they realize, oh, it's not really quite what I expected. It's not really what I want to do. Oh my gosh, I just spent 40 years getting ready for this and it wasn't the right thing anyway. And I think sort of being able to mix in the thing you really want to do with the thing that makes you a living or whatever else is a much better strategy than, do the thing where you're sort of pushing really hard to get the capability to do that. Having said that, there are things where, I don't know. I mean, there are cases where you have to make a certain amount of money to be able to do a particular kind of thing, and but don't save it up your whole life, expecting that when you retire you'll do this. That seems to be, in my observation, kind of a mistake. let's see. Ure asks, actually, okay, Eigen is asking, what do you think about code review and peer review? Does it slow down a company or research? Do you think there are alternatives to this? Well, those are very different things. I mean, in the notion of kind of the pull request code review type mechanism, that's pretty good. I mean, we've been doing that for years now, and I think that's a pretty good, nice mechanism to be able to kind of have, when you're developing something like software, being able to, at the moment when code is being committed, having somebody review it, it's a good idea. Seems to just work fine. The sort of the peer review where you're asking person A, what do you think of person B in a company? We haven't really done that. And that sounds to me like it's one of these weird sort of political favorites stories that is just will lead to horrifying gaming and doesn't seem like a great idea to me. I mean, when you look at other examples of sort of the peer review process, like in academia, it's a flaming disaster, in my opinion. I mean, it's a heavily gamed process where, if you're peer reviewing some journal article, my theory of what most people do is it's kind of a natural selection theory. It's kind of like, if this article promotes their interest and refers to their work and so on, accept. If it doesn't, reject. And over the course of time, maybe that improves your researcher's lot and so on. I think it's really not a great mechanism, and it's one where in my own experience back when I haven't published I haven't done the traditional send a paper to an academic journal since 1986. Even though I write and produce lots of kind of academic type material, I've not chosen to do it that way, because one of the things I noticed was anything you do that's actually really quite good and original, it's sort of hopeless in this institutional structure. It's kind of like the only way it gets through the institutional structure is by essentially social gaming, as in, oh, you got to know the people and attach it to this and that, and then you can sort of socially have it succeed, even though intellectually people are like, what the heck is this? It's something new. I don't understand it, and many people, though, a small number of people who'll take the point of view, oh, it's something new. I can see it's kind of interesting, let's put it out there in the world. Let's support this. But most people don't do that. Most people are like, it's something new. I don't understand it. It's bad. Let's just, push it aside, so to speak. So I think in those settings, I don't think I think it's a rather bad mechanism to do this kind of, peer review. It's kind of a thing that forces kind of a reversion to the mean. It's kind of like a lowest common denominator way of proceeding. I think that, and I think the same is true, although we haven't, I think, tried it significantly in our company, of having sort of people rate other people in that kind of way. I don't know. My intuition is it's not a very good idea, and that you hear all these stories about companies where people have come up with these amazing rating systems, like one from a large tech company, you can probably guess which one, but they had an idea that they would rate people. And one of the criteria was, how much computer time have you used for the projects you're doing? And it's like, that's just not a good idea, because, it leads to people sort of running idle loops on computers just in order to improve their ratings and so on. It's kind of like a gameable thing. And I think that's something, in a company like mine, I'm rather pleased with the fact that I think we've managed to largely make things be something where people succeed if they're doing things that are actually good, as opposed to people succeed if they're gaming the system to get, socially supported in this way and that way and the other. That it's kind of, you succeed by doing a good job, so to speak, is I think a good thing to aspire to from a management structure point of view. let's see. Let's see. RBS is asking, how often do you work on the physics project in terms of weeks or months? How do you manage your life to work on this when finding the rule for the universe has no business case? Well, you know, I do things that I find interesting. And in the last little while, I have not been working directly on that aspect of the physics project. I just did a big project on the second law of thermodynamics, which has really informed a bunch of things that I want to do with the physics project. And it has been an example I've used as sort of a piece of foundation for the physics project. So I really wanted to nail that down. Now it's kind of segued into a project on observer theory, which is really directly relevant to the physics project. But there are a bunch of other pieces of the physics project that I really want to do. In terms of why do it? Well, because I want to. Is there a business case? Not that I know of. I mean, I certainly went into the physics project thinking there is no business case for this in less than 200 years. And it turned out that there are many things which have come out of the physics project, more conceptual than direct, but methods and formalism and so on, which I think are, in the much shorter term applicable to things like distributed computing. The mechanism, we started our Wolfram Institute a few months ago now, and that's kind of, I hope, will be kind of part of my venue for working on things for which there is no business case. And it's sort of developing its own kind of culture and way of doing things. And I'm not the one running it. So I'm, again, something very different for me. It's kind of like I'm just getting to do science and not kind of organizationally running what's going on. I think for me, the which project should I work on next type thing, I would say that it's a big mixture. I mean, right now, for example, I just spent a little while working on sort of things related to ChatGPT, both because I find them interesting and because it's a great opportunity for our technology stack. The connection of Wolfram Alpha to large language models is really something quite spectacular and quite unique and quite unexpected and important. So that's a thing. But also, it is realistically, writing sort of an explainer of ChatGPT, which I want to do for my own purposes. At the time I did of a week or two ago, it's kind of like it was a good thing to do because lots of people want to read it and lots of people have read it. And that feels good that it seems like it's useful. So that's a thing to do at this time. And I just made sort of the active decision of I've got various physics project things queued up that I really want to do. And I'm going to postpone them a little bit because I want to work on this particular project right now of sort of the implications of AI, because I think a lot of people are sort of wondering about that. And I want to figure it out. And this is sort of my excuse to kind of try and crispen up things that I've been thinking about for decades and try and write something coherent about them. Let's see. Ettore is asking, how do you deal with confusion and the feeling of, I don't understand this, at least for now? I usually find a concrete thing to work on. Usually the I don't understand it happens when I'm not kind of, standing on bedrock. It happens because I was sort of floating a bit and I kind of like, oh yeah, there's this definition of this. I don't quite understand that, but I can kind of swing in the tree canopy or something from here to there, and maybe I won't, crash. But for me, if I'm sort of standing on the bedrock and can really sort of build things from those foundations where I really understand what's going on, even if it isn't quite as fancy as the thing that I'm trying to do, for me, that's the thing to do, is sort of go back to the bedrock, go back to the foundations and try to build back up to the thing that you don't understand. And try and, a very common thing for me is, okay, there's this thing, I don't know, one's looking at transformer nets or something, and it's like, well, let me find the simpler case of this. Now, sometimes when it gets so simple, it's like the structure isn't there, and you really can't tell what's happening. You can't tell about the real case from the super simple case. But the thing I've found more often is, when you get to that super simple case, by the way, people often never thought about that case because they were always like, oh, well, the simple case, that's not applicable, that's not relevant. So we got to think about this much more elaborate case. And by the way, when they do that, they understand much less. So it can even be a great kind of research strategy to just go down, what's the simpler case? Now, one thing I like to do is, sometimes there'll be some effect, some phenomenon, whatever, and you say, well, what's really behind that phenomenon? Let's get the simpler case where that happens, because at some point, you're not going to see that phenomenon anymore. The thing you're going to be looking at just doesn't have the structure it needs for that phenomenon. I like to see the thing fall apart because that helps me to understand what really is that phenomenon. Is that phenomenon ultimately something whose origin is extremely simple, or is that phenomenon, does it need some other level of structure for one to be able to get that phenomenon? So I find that useful to be able to do that. Okay, there's another question here from Eigen, who's asking some interesting questions here. Several, actually. Okay, given my knowledge of foundations of things like math and physics, do you bother to research fundamental theories of project management or try to formalize project management and those kinds of things? I've often felt a bit embarrassed that I know all this basic science. I've even worked on sort of a lot on the science of complex systems, things like this. And yet I find that I think I use those scientific ideas. I don't really use them in like running a company. It feels much more seat of the pants, emotional, kind of intuition based, do this. My guess is that if you really untangled lots of decisions I've made, lots of things like that they are pretty deeply informed by things that I know from doing kind of science and analytical kinds of things, but it isn't front and center. It's not like I have this, the simulation of a company where I'm working out this and that thing, but there's an intuition that you develop about things that can be figured out, things that can't be figured out, and so on. Plus, in management, in managing companies, things like that, one of the biggest elements is people, and I've always been interested in people, and I've sort of gotten to the point where I think my ability to have some level of analytical sort of thinking about people and what they're interested in and how they'll do things and so on is decently good, I think. And that's a thing that's often applied. And there sort of isn't really a science of that very much, at least as far as I'm concerned. Now, it sort of amuses me that if you look at like prompt engineering for LLMs, it is charmingly like psychology, or maybe it's like animal wrangling. It's like, can you coax the LLM into doing this or that thing? Can you understand, can you get an intuition for this black box of what's happening inside the AI to the point where you can say just the right things to it to elicit some particular kind of response? But maybe I shouldn't have said that there's sort of no science of kind of the psychology of how people work. I mean, the science of psychology has plenty in it, most of which I know nothing about. But sort of over the course of time, I think I've developed kind of mostly by example. I've kind of been the machine learning training, being trained by just seeing lots of examples. Look, I've seen something a bit like that before. When I see this particular characteristic in individuals, this happens, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's, let's see. Eigen's also asking about mentoring. What's about the process of picking a mentoree? Do you look for specific clues? Is there anything an individual can do to stand out? I've ended up with two types of mentorees, and I've enjoyed, over the course of, 40 years, more than that, mentoring all sorts of people. I would say that two categories. It's usually, I would say that the top categories are CEOs and kids. And I was realizing recently, what is in common between CEOs and kids? And I think the answer is that both of them are types of people where they sort of believe that anything is possible. CEO of some tech company, it's like, we're going to do amazing things, we're going to get to the moon type thing. Kids often are like, I can do anything. Some think that at least. Those are both sort of interesting moments, the interesting kinds of situations in which to sort of do mentoring, because it's sort of the you can help people go in a direction where they could do anything. I think the other case that I found interesting in some situations, particularly with kids, is like the situation is just a total mess. Actually, that happens with CEOs as well. And it's like, can you find your way out of this box? Can you be creative and solve this problem and find a path out of this box? And that's kind of a satisfying thing to do. And sometimes the box that exists is one that I know nothing about. It's a situation in the world that I really have not encountered myself. I really don't know anything about. And that makes it interesting to me as something where I learn something about the world, and also have the sort of fulfilling feeling of having helped some person with some situation that one can help untangle, so to speak. But those are a couple of cases. I would say that the case that is probably less interesting to me is the case where it's kind of like sort of everything, it's on a path. There is a well-defined path, and you kind of, unless you fall off the path, you're going to go on that path and everything's going to be just fine. And there isn't a really high upside, there isn't a really low downside. Just follow that path. I don't feel like I can be that useful in a case like that. And it's not, unless it's, particularly when it's a path where I kind of seen that path before, it's like, well, it's not really, I'm not learning much from this, and I don't think I'm contributing much to it. It's usually, I would say, the cases where I'm probably the most useful are where it's just a totally wild situation for one reason or another. It's a company in a wild, in doing wild things, or in a wild problem situation, or similarly with people. I mean, when the wildness with people gets more into the psychological issues thing, then I've at that point I don't know enough and I sort of give up. But when it's more sort of exogenous factors of there's a complicated tangle of things going on, and there is a path that is not so much about that's not an issue of its own internal making. It's more, well, it's not quite fair to say that one doesn't deal with that, because I think even with the CEO crowd, for example, it's pretty common to find, a very common question is, you got some person with a company and they're doing this and they're doing that, and they're trying to figure out whether to do this or whether to do that. And it's like, okay, what do you actually want to do? And it's like, well, I should do this and I should do that, and whatever. What do you actually want to do? Because, often that question, people have felt they can't really ask that question of themselves. But when they do, it's kind of obvious what they should do. And it's kind of obvious. And it's like, okay, but, can you do that and not, damage your investors, employees, customers, whatever else? Okay, first figure out what you want to do. Then figure out how do you get a good outcome for other people, given that you know what you want to do. At least I found that that's a useful way to think about things in certain cases there. So that's been a sort of a rough outline. But plus, I mean, at some level, I kind of, there are mechanics of, you can't really mentor somebody who you can't communicate with in English. In my case, you can't really, if the person is really, really closed and just won't express themselves about things, and that happens both to CEOs and kids, it makes it much more difficult. You can't really tell, you can't really tell what's going on. If there's a kind of a shell that's too thick and you can't, there's nothing really to help with if you're just dealing with some kind of outer shell. I think And it always helps if you just enjoy the person, find them interesting. Although I have to say, for me, there's a pretty wide range of people for whom I find that to be the case, and so that's much less of a factor as far as I'm concerned. And you know, sometimes it's like, you know, you're dealing with people who you think are super arrogant. It's like, I don't really care. It's kind of amusing, or they're really that, you know, who you might say, oh, this person's totally obnoxious, I can't deal with them. That isn't usually the problem, so to speak. All right, maybe one. Let's see. E-Ray is asking, saying, I seem to care a lot about history of ideas in scientific areas. Do you think this is a must for producing meaningful work in research? No, I think that it depends how much you need to understand of what has gone before. There are plenty of areas of research where the problem is pretty well defined. It's kind of a barren landscape. There isn't a lot there, and you just have to build something new. In that case, understanding what's gone before is not that important. In cases where you sort of need to really build on the ideas that have gone before, and particularly when the ideas that have gone before don't ring quite true, they don't really quite fit with what you think now, it's really useful to understand the history, because often the version of the idea that you thought you had based on textbooks, papers, current research, and so on, is actually not what the original idea was. And the original idea actually makes a lot more sense often than the evolved version of the idea that was being presented in textbooks today. And for me, often to understand what the idea really is, it's super useful to go back and see kind of where that idea came from. And sometimes it's kind of like, where's the magic in something? Take neural nets, for instance. Knowing that the neural nets of today are structurally, at least in general terms, very similar to the neural nets from the 1940s is quite useful. It's kind of like, you know, when you're looking for what's the magic today, you're not looking, is the magic in the foundations like that? And, you know, you're looking for sort of other sources of magic, and knowing what that historical progression is important for knowing sort of where's the magic, so to speak. You know, is the, so I found it really useful. And I've also found, because I often work on sort of foundational kinds of things, people thought about the foundations when an area was being formed. Later on, they didn't think about the foundations. And sometimes you have to drill through all of the structure that's been built on top of the foundations. You have to drill through those to get to the point where you can engage with the foundations you're actually interested in. And sometimes, quite often actually, you find actually those foundations are, you know, built on sand. Those foundations were like very wonky at the time when they were originally constructed. And yet people have built on top of them, and people have built so much on top that they're really, you know, they just assume those foundations. And it's really important to go back and see why that happened. Now, I just find when I try to get an intuition for a field, understanding the type of thinking that was going on among the people who created the field is really useful. I mean, understanding that something was done, oh, I don't know, for some particular application, because all the language of that field may be oriented towards that application. It's like, why do they call it that? Oh, it's because they were thinking about making these kinds of machines, and that's why this whole field was named in that way. And that's useful, because otherwise, and then it helps you kind of reason about the field to know sort of what the original application area was. Why did they go in this direction and not in that direction? Oh, it's because they were aiming for this particular application area. All right, maybe one last question here from Olicus, saying they work as an innovation consultant, and for a year started a journey to create, redesign, innovate, develop new type of computer case. Case as in what you put a computer in, or case as in thing that you do with a computer? I'm not sure, but anyway, I feel like I don't have a chance against all the giants. How do I overcome this feeling? Well, you know, I think if you're doing something that the giants are already doing, then it's tough. I think the thing to do is to find the niche that, for whatever reason, is not of interest to, or not sort of philosophically compatible with, or business compatible with what the giants are doing, so to speak. And there are things where there's a distribution channel that's been built by giants that you simply don't have access to, and will make it pretty much impossible for you to to enter that. What I would say is, the thing to do is, what's the twist? What's the thing that is the reason you're doing your project? Because if your project's already been done, why are you doing it? It's kind of like, well, there's a thing that maybe you have some particular use case, and the giants are not ever going to tackle that use case because it's too small. The giants don't care unless the thing is a $10 billion business, and the thing you're going to do is a $10 million business, and that's great for you, but it's kind of too small for the giants to ever care. That's an example of a type of thing. But I think that it's like, well, how are you unique? Emphasize the uniqueness. Don't, and if you think the thing you're doing, I mean, one feature of very big companies is, as I say, they don't do things which are the $10 million opportunity. So unless your opportunity is visibly a $10 billion opportunity, they're not going to come and squash it, so to speak, typically, most cases. I think that, sometimes what happens is the big companies thought that was a $10 million opportunity and ignored it, and it gradually grew and became a $1 billion opportunity. And then they're like, oh, drat, we ignored that. Now we're going to spend $1 gazillion to try and buy that thing so that we can now get back on that track. I think that's that's the type of thing. But I would say that my main comment would be, you just have to have a unique niche, and if you don't, that's a problem. In terms of, you have to be able to explain sort of, if you say, well, an interesting case actually in recent times is search engines. Okay, sometimes there are cases where, in a case like that, people had the idea it's super, super difficult to build a search engine, so nobody tried. And maybe it wasn't so difficult, actually. I mean, the details are difficult, no question. They've become a little bit easier, but the details are difficult. But it's sort of a case where somebody says, well, I'm going to build a search engine, and you might say, that's hopeless. I think so long as you have a thing you're going to do that's like, well, I'm not, let's say I'm not going to have advertising, I'm going to have subscriptions instead. Well, that's just not something the big players are going to do, because they have a definite business model, and, collecting, $5 million a year in subscriptions is completely uninteresting to them. So it's not if somebody proves that you can make billions of dollars with subscriptions, that story may change. But I think anyway, so I mean, my main point would be, just make sure you have a thing where you can explain why the niche you're in is not a niche that is just sufficiently different, and is presented sufficiently differently, and reaches customers in a sufficiently different way, that sort of there's a separate thing to think about that isn't just the that's not sort of already drowned in what's been done by the sort of the biggest tech companies. All right, I better stop and go back to my day job, but thanks for asking lots of interesting questions, and I look forward to doing this again in due course. Thanks, and bye for now.